I always felt that my relapses were failures. And I felt like such a failure because I kept coming back to NA meetings and I kept coming back to rehabs. And there would be people there that were there when I was there the first time, and now they had 2 years, 3 years, and then there's me, coming back once again homeless, once again strung out, just failing over and over and over again. And I always felt such a deep sense of disappointment in myself. Welcome back, NodPod. Thank you guys so much for joining me for another episode of Chasing Heroin. I'm very excited for a few different reasons. One, we are bringing back the Sunday Spin Snack, rebranded as the Sunday Sober Snack. And if you are just joining me for the first time, my name is Jeannine. After 15 years of active addiction that left me homeless and living in a doghouse in the end, in and out of jail, I've now been clean and sober since January of 2015 and have made it my life's purpose to share with other people the ways in which I was able to stop, the ways in which other people have been able to stop, because I really believed to the deepest parts of my soul that I would die a dope fiend and that I would die a drug addict. And I was wrong. And I want anyone else out there to know that there is hope and there are solutions. So this show is about doing exactly that, bringing you hope and bringing you solutions. So the Sober Spin Snack was a weekly bite-sized episode on Sundays, anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, with just little bits of information, with just little bits of inspirational messaging that I would share in my spin classes, because I also teach fitness. And I would like to bring those back. I had a little bit of a crazy year. My long-term listeners know my husband relapsed and it was like crazy. He's now doing very well. And I would love to bring these back. And again, rebranded as the Sunday Sober Snack, which is actually really hard to say. On the way up here, I was saying Sunday Snober Snack, like over and over and over again. Anyways, Sunday Sober Snack will be bite-sized bits of sober inspiration, sober information, and hopefully some stuff that you guys can use in your sobriety journey. But we will also talk about ways to apply that information to our life beyond sobriety, especially like I've got, 9 years. A lot of my listeners are in long-term recovery. How can we apply the principles that work in early recovery to also help us leverage our lives for more success and long-term recovery? And I'm always looking for ways to find parallels between the two, which is actually really easy to do. Most recovery principles can be applied not just for recovery, but as a general design for living and design for better living. And the second reason I'm super excited is if you are watching on Spotify or YouTube, you can see I am in this beautiful studio in Beverly Hills. I am recording at Synergy Recovery in Beverly Hills. They do IOP, they do inpatient, they do detox, and they reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to use our studio? And I said, yeah, absolutely. So drove up to Beverly Hills today, and we're going to bring some of these sober Sunday snacks to you guys. So today we're going to talk about something that I just recently came across in the past month. And I made a little TikTok about this as well. So some of you guys may have seen this. So a golf ball, right? They've got dents, holes all over them. So they weren't always like that. I guess initially golf balls were smooth. And as people began hitting them over and over and over again, they noticed that the more dents that were in the golf ball, the better it did, because the pockets allowed it to navigate the air better, right? Like if it was smooth and it was driving against the air, it was meeting more resistance and slowing it down. But when it gave it the pockets, it had the ability to navigate the air a little bit better. The resistance could kind of dip in, which makes sense. So that's our golf ball. And then we also take a piñata. We all know what a piñata is. Something made of paper mache. And the more times you hit it, eventually it cracks open and everything that is inside comes out, right? And I heard this information about the golf ball. And I was listening to an episode of Jack Canfield's podcast. Jack Canfield is somebody that I love. He wrote Chicken Soup for the Soul, and he's got a podcast now that I have been just like consuming obsessively. I love the way that he speaks and does these analogies. And the analogy that he used was with the golf ball and said that seemingly it's damage, right? But what it actually does is it allows the golf ball to navigate resistance, as is the same with people. Every time we try something new, put ourselves out there, try something and fail, take a risk and it doesn't completely go our way, start a new business, anytime we put ourselves out there in some way and we seemingly don't get exactly what we wanted, every time we get a little bit more, you'd think, damage, it's actually adding up to experience that allows us to better execute in the future. Every little ding, every little dent is actually making us smarter as we move forward through the world and is actually making us more able to be successful because we're learning from each of these things, right? And, when I think about relapsing in particular, it really hammers that home for me and drives that home for me because I always felt that my relapses were failures. And I felt like such a failure because I kept coming back to NA meetings and I kept coming back to rehabs. And there would be people there that were there when I was there the first time. And now they had 2 years, 3 years. And then there's me, coming back once again, homeless, once again, strung out, just failing over and over and over again. And I always felt such a deep sense of disappointment in myself and such a deep sense of failure directly tied to my relapses. And then some of you guys may have heard me share this before, but in year 5 on this show, Kim read a card to me on air. It was really nice about like my 5 years. And before we got there though, and I actually didn't change my idea around relapse until my year 5 of recovery. And I was doing this show. I was doing an episode of Chasing Heroin with my original co-host, Kim. And she was asking me questions because, you guys know the story, right? I went from living in the doghouse to owning the gym within 4 years. And she said, well, when you got back, you had 0 resources at all. So how did you start putting your life back together? And I said, well, I was already in touch with Rachel. And she said, oh, you already knew her. And I said, oh yeah, she'd been my sponsor for a while. I just started calling her again. And there were meetings that I could walk to near my sober living. And so I was walking to all those meetings and making sure I was getting there. And she said, oh, so you were familiar with the sober living and the meetings near there? And I said, well, yeah, I'd lived there before. And so I knew the sober living. I knew the guy that owned it. That's why he let me live there. And I knew where all the meetings were that were in walking distance. And as we were speaking, I realized that all of those relapses were giving me new information and insight every time. One of my forays back into recovery, I met Rachel, right? Another time that I came back in, I found that sober living, the one that I eventually lived at in the end and, got and stayed clean in. I found the meetings that we could walk to. I learned something new from the steps and from reading the literature. Every time I came in, I was learning something new. And so this last time, I had all that information to pull from and become more successful in longer term recovery. And I've seen that in other ways too, even in my teaching career. So I've been teaching, forever. And I remember I was doing a boot camp for my current studio. Actually, I used to teach there as well back in 2018. And I was doing a boot camp and I'd been teaching spin for a long time. I'd been teaching for like 9 years. And spin had grown and developed over the years though, right? Aspects of fitness had developed. And I was doing the boot camp at my current studio that I'm now back at. And so I had auditioned for this studio, been teaching for 9 years, got in to do the boot camp. And during the boot camp, it became clear to me that, spin had advanced a lot over the years, as things do. And people were doing new things I wasn't as familiar with. And it was pretty clear that I needed to learn more stuff if I wanted to stay viable in that career, which of course I did and I do. And and I was teaching somewhere else as well, the studio I ended up owning. And I was kind of a big shot over there, right? I'd been there 4 years and everybody loved me and the owners didn't tell me how to teach or anything. I could kind of do whatever I wanted, which was what I had always done in terms of the way that I taught spin, right? I'd always done this certain way and I was continuing to do that. And then I'm in this boot camp and I'll never forget, they call him the master instructor. The master instructor that was there after I was done teaching, she just kind of sat there. And so I used to do this thing where I would sing while I was teaching. So there was that and a few other things. And she was pretty nice about it, but she made it really clear that I had some growing to do. And I'm up on the podium under the hot lights, like a spotlight, like you're on a stage with all of the other instructors going through boot camp there. And my ego was pretty dismantled in that moment, because one of the things that she did say, she was like, so you were singing a lot? And I said, yeah, I do that. And she said, do you have any professional vocal training or? And I said, no. And she said, okay, so I'm going to recommend that you let the singers sing in your music, and you can rock out silently, because, you know, people are here to hear the artist sing and not you. And when I tell that story, everybody's always like, oh my God, what a bitch. And so but she didn't say it rudely. She said it kind of funny and in a way that really sunk in. And what felt like a little damage to my ego ultimately made me much better. I still sang on the mic, but there was a bunch of other things that she suggested that I needed to do. I taught spin more like a yoga class in terms of being like really mellow. I needed to elevate my game that way. And so what felt like some damage in the moment to my ego actually ultimately made me so much better in my career. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. I put myself out there for that boot camp to do something new. It was super scary to do. I didn't know any choreography yet. There was, you know, again, like I said, you know, spin had definitely progressed in different ways. And what felt like these little nicks to my ego were actually advancing me with work. And even more recently, so I did the Sober Motivation podcast. I don't know if you guys saw that. I did Brad's podcast, and we spoke afterwards, and he mentioned something like, and he's a super nice guy, but he said, well, I had to do a ton of editing on this one. And I thought maybe it was because I was cussing a lot. And I said, oh yeah, I was probably cussing a lot. And he said, no, actually you weren't. And he started laughing. He said, you say like a lot. And it kind of like struck me for a second. And he said, I think my software picked up on you saying like 400 times in an hour interview. You guys, like, hearing that was a little embarrassing, but he's totally right. As I try to make my TikToks now, I try to cut out, I'll just speak and then I have to go back and edit. And I do say like so much. I have to go through and pull it out, and it makes it difficult to edit. But again, I need to cut that out of my vernacular as I'm doing these episodes, as I'm doing other interviews. So what felt like a little ding to my ego is actually going to help me navigate moving forward with the podcast better, right? Does that make sense? And so I love this idea that the more damage a golf ball gets, the better it navigates the air. The more dings and dents and experience we get and advice that we get, instruction that we get from, you know, people that we work with, the better we get at navigating our chosen path. I love this idea because it allows us to see feedback like that we could take critically, instead of taking it as, oh, this is a liability of mine. We can make it an asset because now I know that, right? So it makes the damage not a liability. It makes it an asset. And you guys know that's one of my main messages with sobriety in general. I think that our addiction and our alcoholism are not liabilities. They are our greatest assets and strengths, because now I do this type of work as someone in recovery, and I didn't really do this kind of stuff. I didn't do any personal growth development work, any real introspection prior to getting into active recovery and working with other people. And it's the same idea to me with a piñata. So if the piñata is your addiction, same idea. Every single time you come in, maybe the first time you come in, you just try methadone and the classes at the clinic, the groups, and that doesn't necessarily work. Maybe the next time you come in, you start actually going to meetings. Maybe you learn a little bit, you get a couple of phone numbers, and then you come back in again. Maybe you end up actually going to residential treatment and going through detox. And every time you come in, you're taking another whack at that piñata and another whack at that piñata and another whack at that piñata. And eventually it goes. And I feel like you never know which whack will be your last whack, right? Just like with an actual piñata. I had no reason at all to believe that this venture into recovery would actually be the last one. I didn't believe it at all, actually. You guys, I know, have heard the story a million times, but when I was out at Larry's house, when I was out at my friend's house that picked me up from the doghouse, I had absolutely no reason to believe that this would work. None. I wasn't in a program. I wasn't in jail. I was just out on the streets. But I had taken enough whacks at the piñata of addiction that I had learned enough that when I was ready to execute on that information, I was able to. And I had way more information and knowledge at my disposal than I did in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, when I first actively started trying to quit drugs. And for my friends in longer term recovery, So those of you listening because you're sober curious, this is something that you're thinking about, or like me, you're not sober curious. You're like full on, no, you need to stop and just are struggling with it. I want to encourage you, take another whack at the piñata, show up at a meeting. What does one more effort look like for you? If you're not a 12-step person, what does one more effort look like for you? What does one more action look like for you to put yourself back out there? You never know when it's going to be the last one. And for my friends on longer term recovery, how do we apply this to our life now? So for me, with social media and with the podcast, I've done better than I would have expected, but it's not where I want it, right? You guys know I talk about that a lot. And seeing other people, and something about me has always thought that success should be really easy, and that if it's not easy, then I'm not doing the right thing. Like if I'm having to really work hard at something, I feel like that's a mistake, and that it should be really, really easy. And I don't know what it is about my personality that's like that. I think that that's a bit of an addiction side too, like the quick fix, the easy money. I think to some extent alcoholic addicts all like have this. And so I was thinking about my friend Dave, who hosts the Dopey podcast, which is the #1 recovery podcast in existence. I mean, he's at like 1 million downloads every 6 weeks or something insane. And when you listen to his show, it sounds as though it's effortless for him. And he's got the vibe of, for those of you that went to rehab, the cool guy in your rehab is usually a heroin addict and super funny. And he was the funny guy, right? He was intelligent, but he was also funny. He was like the coolest guy in rehab. Dave gives coolest guy in rehab vibes, right? The heroin addict, coolest guy in rehab vibes. And when I first started listening to his show, I assumed that he and his friend Chris had just thrown it together. And then effortlessly, it became what it is now. Since knowing him, I've learned that that's not true at all. It was very planned. They definitely had an idea of what they wanted to do. And he tries so hard. Talk about taking whacks at piñatas. He is constantly doing his best to up the quality of his show. A few months ago, he said, you need to teach me about TikTok. I need to be doing more on TikTok. I need to be doing more on YouTube. He actually asked me like a few months ago, do I need to be working harder? Am I working hard enough, or am I not working hard enough? And that blew my mind, but it also really inspired me because it seemed like it should just be easy, right? And I've learned that, again, these people that I see that are where I want to be are taking multiple whacks at the piñata all the time. And so as we move forward together on our journeys of either sobriety or personal growth and development, or both like me, I want us to look at the feedback and the criticism that we get as dents on golf balls that are going to help us navigate our future a little bit better. And I want to look at our attempts and our forays into recovery and sobriety as wax on the piñata. And you never know when the last one is going to go through and actually work. So thank you guys for checking in again this week, and we'll see you next Sunday.